All right, so now what I want you to do is we're in lesson number 6. I want you to create a new Windows Forms application, and I want you to pause this video, and I want you to practice creating the user interface controls. So we need a button here, and you'll notice if you look at the lower right in my properties, I've called this button underscore numbers. Then we need a add button, a subtract button, divide, and a multiply button. And then we just need a text box to show the result, and I called this text underscore numbers for the control name. So go ahead and pause this, practice creating basically all of your controls and your form user interface here, and then we'll go ahead and get started after that. Now, once you've got your form user interface all designed and created, let's just go ahead and double click on the numbers button. That's going to, again, create an event handler and a block of code for us to execute that whenever the user presses this numbers button, it's going to run the code that's in between this open curly bracket and close curly bracket. All right, let's declare a couple of variables. First, I'm going to go ahead and say double, and we'll say number 1 equals 34.56. And again, every C# statement needs to end with a semicolon. Let's hit return and let's do double number 2 equals 23.5. All right, now essentially with numbers, whether it's integers or doubles here with numbers with decimals, essentially we can do some basic operators here, some simple math operators such as number 1 plus number 2. And that's going to give us a resultant double value of adding those two together. Now, it's basically just saying here, hey, what are you doing? Like you're adding these two things, but are you trying to assign that to something? What are you trying to do here? So we're just going to go ahead and say double is the result of that. So we'll just say result number equals number 1 plus number 2. Now, if we want to actually get that into the text box, we have text underscore numbers dot text. And again, when you look at the IntelliSense here, it tells you that the data type that the text box text field is expecting is a string, and we have a double value. So again, we need to convert this this result number to string. So we're going to say result number dot toString, which again is a function or a method, and that's going to convert this double value to a string value. That way it can be then appearing in the dialog box. All right, let's go up to build menu, build solution. Now, I'm going to stop showing you that, and I'm going to skip that step of doing the build solution. All you really need to do is press the start button here for the debugging start, because what that'll do is it'll actually first try to build the application and the executable first, and then it'll actually run it right afterwards. So there we go. So now I'm going to press numbers button, and we have 58.06. So it added number 1 and number 2 together, and it resulted that into the text numbers.text field. So there we go. So we can go ahead and close that down. Now, what you can do is you can basically go ahead from here and you can double click on each of these additional buttons, and it will create event handlers for each of those buttons. So now we have an add click block of code, a subtract click, divide click, and multiply. And what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and pause, and you can just copy paste basically this code into each of these specific things and then just change the operator. So instead of plus here, let's just go ahead and do a minus, and let's see what happens. And you can change the numbers and do whatever you want. And ultimately, notice here that I'm actually declaring number 1 and number 2, and I'm doing it again in a separate area of code. If I'm declaring this variable here inside of this block of code, then it's only going to be within that specific area. So number 1 will not be seen down here. So right, if I try to type in number 1, notice that it doesn't exist in the IntelliSense because that variable is only declared in this block of code. I'm going to explain more about that when we get into classes and fields and properties later. But I just wanted you to understand that essentially when you're copying and pasting this code, this was behaving differently than earlier. If I try to do this, double number 1 equals 34 or 43, notice that Visual Studio doesn't like this because you can't declare the same variable name again within the same block of code using the same name. So I could call this number 3. That would work. And notice that the IntelliSense error goes away. Or what I could do is I could actually just say number 1 is a different value. So let's just say 56. not minus, sorry. Let's do an equal sign. All right. So once you declare a variable, you don't have to put the double type again, or the data type in front of it again. You can just reassign that variable to a new value, and you can do that within that same block of code. So because we're declaring number one inside of these curly brackets here, inside of this event handler, number one only lives inside of this block of code, and this number one over here in this block of code only lives inside of this, and they don't see each other outside of these curly brackets. Okay, so hopefully you paused the video and you copy pasted some code and you tested by changing the different operator here, right? So we had basically this numbers, which did something at the top. Then we had an add, we had a subtract button, we had a divide button and a multiply. And I hope you changed some of the numbers and tried those out and saw what you got. Now, let's just say that this is really irritating that we have to do this number one and this number two, and it kind of hopefully you get this natural feeling of like, wow, this is really irritating to declare number one and number two over and over again in multiple lines of code. So let's start out by actually making some class level basically fields here or variables that we can use across multiple code blocks. So just a little bit ago in the video, I was explaining how number one only lives in this code block, and then number one in here only lives in this code block. Well, rather than having to declare number one and two over and over again, let's actually come up here and we'll just say double number one, and then we'll say double number two. And we can actually assign the values to right now. So let's just say 10, and then let's say equals 30 as a starting point. And now check this out. I can actually get rid of this number one and this number two. And notice when I do that, because I assign this at the class level, sort of outside of these code blocks, but within the class itself, this form classes code block, the open curly bracket and then the close curly bracket here, basically I can use these variables across all of the code blocks in this class. So watch this. I'll just get rid of that. I'll get rid of that. And I'll get rid of these. And now, when I build this application, let's make sure there's no bugs. Everything built. We'll go ahead and run it. And when I press each of these buttons, there's 40, 20, 3, and then 300. So essentially, it took this number one and this number two, and it just basically did the different operators here and made the result difference and displayed that in the text box. I mean, we could have even done that with the resultant number and made that a class level variable as well. So if you want to pause the video and try that out and see if you can get that code to work, then go ahead and do so. All right, so the last thing I'm going to show you here is the order of operations, especially when you're dealing with parentheses, and then also the math class for more complex things like that. So if you actually, on your form designer, if you see the numbers button, if you double click on it, that'll bring you into this code block here of button numbers click event. I'm just going to go ahead and I'll leave the bottom value here, and we'll actually leave this result number, but we're going to just go ahead and change some things here in this result numbers formula. So essentially what we'll do is we'll just say 34.5 plus, then I'll do this, I'll just say 45 times 6 minus 32 divided by 3. Okay, so if you remember in basic math, like class, or your pre-algebra class in junior high, where you have the, order of operations, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, etc., etc. Essentially, coding works the same way. It'll follow a logical order of operations for coding. So if you're trying to get certain things to be multiplied or done first in your number operators here with addition, multiplication, subtraction, etc., then essentially you can use parentheses to sort of create and force certain order of operations. So let's just go ahead and see if this code actually works. So if I go ahead and press play, I'll go ahead and say numbers, and then here we have 294.5. So if you want to double check that on your calculator or do that by hand and see if the computer got the results that you expected based on what I typed here, go ahead and do so. All right, so the last thing I'm going to show you here related to numbers is if you want to do some stuff beyond just basic operators such as addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, you can actually come in here and use the math class. So let's go ahead and get rid of these numbers and we'll type in the word math. Now, Visual Studio is going to show a class called math under the system.math namespace. And so if we come in here and say math dot, you'll see that there's a variety of different methods or functions as well as properties for certain numbers. So let's say, for instance, here we're looking for the value of pi if we're going to do some stuff with arcs or circles. So here we can actually get the pi number. And so if we just set that and we run that, and we just press our button, we see that 3.14 has been displayed as a result of that. Now, what are some other useful things in here underneath the math class? Well, a couple of things I can think of that I use almost all the time are trig functions. So you can have tan, there's cosine, and then there's sine. So if you need to do any kind of trig work, you can make those. And you can actually look up online to see a deeper description if the main description here isn't good enough, or code examples to show you how to leverage these a bit more. But another one that I commonly use is absolute value. So sometimes I'm just trying to get, I don't care whether something's negative or not, and I want to convert it to positive if it is negative, and if it's already positive, then I'll just use that. So there's this absolute value. So let's say -4 as an example. And if I run this code, I get 4. So it just makes the absolute value of whatever integer or number that I put in there. And so then another good one is max or min. So basically, if you have two different variables and you're trying to see if which one's the larger of the two numbers, and I want to return the larger of these two values. So let's just say 3 and then 5. So you enter in the two different variables. And then we just say numbers, and it shows math.max returns out of 3 and 5, it returns 5 as the maximum number. So again, I'm going to just quickly go to Google, and I'm going to show you how to look up online whenever you're trying to find out more information about a specific class or something like that, or certain methods, and get code examples. I'm going to show you that. But this math class is really fantastic for doing things beyond basic addition and subtraction operators, etc. Okay, so here on Google, we can just type in C#, and C# is a good starting point because that's essentially going to narrow down that you're specifically looking for C# code. And then we can just say math dot, and you'll see here, basically it gives you a lot of previews, right? So let's look up math.ceiling and figure out what that is. So it says math.ceiling method, which is a function, right? This ceiling function returns the ceiling value of something. So let's go ahead and click on that. And sometimes it'll bring you to Microsoft's documentation for the .NET framework and different classes and methods and things. And then sometimes what it'll do is if you scroll down, it'll give you a list of code examples so you can kind of see how things work. And it'll give you explanations. Then there's a whole bunch of other people that just different communities and things that you can join that have code examples. I'm telling you that pretty much as a programmer for, I don't know, maybe since about 2008, I have pretty much been learning how to do things or finding code snippets and examples and explanations of things, not from a book, but pretty much from doing a search online. So whenever you're learning something new, if I don't go deep enough into it here in these introductory videos, you can always search for that online. There will either be a video or tons of code examples for you to go ahead and work from.